Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse. In this episode, we talk about the murder of Charlie Kirk. Everybody is processing this and trying to make sense of it. We don't tie any nice, tidy bows on any of it or what it means or what it can mean. We can't know the future. But we do, as Christians, lay down a couple frameworks and markers that might be categories that are helpful for you to work through as you process this yourself. I think you'll find this helpful.
We're going to talk about the murder of Charlie Kirk. And you'll need to bear with us for a number of different reasons. This is first and foremost a developing story. New facts are coming to light on an hourly basis right now. And so we're all learning as we go here. And this is a pre-recorded episode. So
we're recording at the point in which a suspect, Tyler, has been apprehended. But that's just basically all we know.
That's all we know as of this recording. So yeah, if we sound a bit tentative or if some of this sounds dated, it will be by the time you hear this. So there's that. That's just necessary to state. The response to this has been unbelievably strong from just about everybody. Some people have been just heartbroken and are outraged and are enraged. Others are gleeful and making tasteless remarks and making tasteless videos. Some reporters are losing their jobs over some of those tasteless remarks. So very, very strong response. I think, Nathan, you mentioned a few of the people who said that this is one of those possibly paradigm shifting events. Peggy Noonan, I believe, was one of those voices.
Wall Street Journal.
For many, in Wall Street Journal, Peggy Noonan writing that for many, this is a decisive historical moment. There will be the world before this event and then the world after this event. So all that to say, very, very strong reactions. And so we want to operate as carefully as we can, but we also want to speak as clearly as we can as well. I think the first thing we need to note is, yeah, Nathan, let's hear.
Well, I want to say that the way in which this podcast can be helpful. We can't speak to you pastorally. We don't know you. We can't hear your thoughts in real time coming back and forth. And so a conversation is better. And so if you're processing something in grief, you need to be talking to an actual person. But what we can do is propose sort of a framework of categories of processing. I think as Cameron and I have talked about this over the last day or so, that's what's been helpful to me. Not like we put tie up a nice tidy bow on the end of thing, but just to lay out some categories to be thinking in to deal with some of our thoughts and emotions as we go along. And so that's my hope for this podcast, is this becomes a framework for helping you process and think. Charlie Kirk is still dead at the end of this podcast, and it's horrendous. But as you're trying to make sense of it in the days to come and you're talking to people who are trying to make sense of it, we want to give you some hooks to hang some thoughts on as we go by. That's our goal here.
The first thing we need to say then along those lines, Nathan, is that Charlie Kirk, a son, a brother, a husband, and a father, has been murdered in cold blood. And it's horrific and deeply, deeply sad. And I think, Nathan, as I was thinking about this as well, I think it was Glenn Scrivener actually helped me to understand some of what it was in me that was reacting as well, because there was something that hit me also on a visceral level here. And I think, and as I thought about it, I realized I often, and you often, Nathan, in our career, we have traveled and gone to university campuses and discussed highly contentious issues with people not only who disagree with us, but who believe that our views are pernicious and harmful to others. And we've done this for I've done this for 15 years. You've done it to a similar timeline, and we've done it in places like you did it in New England, hardly friendly territory to some of these conversations. The church, I remember going to the University of California, Berkeley. We arrived 1 week after riots because of Milo Yiannopoulos' possible visit there. They had just replaced the glass in the windows in the student center when we were there. And I remember when I did it wasn't really a debate. It was more of it was a dialogue with two skeptics, but it was no way to not see it as two skeptics versus the Christian on has science disproved God? And I remember the auditorium absolutely filled up to the brim, and nobody knew who the heck I was. I was absolute nobody. So there's another important difference between us and Charlie Kirk, who had, I mean, his star was only on the rise. I mean, he was highly, highly articulate, unbelievably gifted public communicator, very quick on his feet. And I have to give, I mean, I mean, I've got to give him credit, engaged in civil dialogue with people who disagreed with him and did so over and over again. I mean, it takes real courage and conviction to do that, and walked into the lion's den repeatedly. But anyway, I think that was one of the reasons why it hit me, just on a personal note, hit me quite hard, because I thought this feels somewhat more adjacent to some of what I do and have done, and it kind of brought that home to me.
Yeah. There's something to be said here is that we don't do a podcast every time somebody is killed. And other people were killed on that same day, high school shootings, fill in the blank, other various murders. The reason we're choosing to discuss this one, all of them are tragic. All of them are family members and loved ones. But the reason we're discussing this one is because it is so uniquely connected to so many people and is such a connective
Point.
flashpoint for so many things, so many tensions that are already existing in our culture. This doesn't arise out of a vacuum, and I think we'll parse out kind of some of those issues as we go along here to think about. But that's why we're giving special attention to this one, is because it is linked to so many elements that are active in the lives of so many people, in the minds of so many people.
A second thing that we need to say then is that Charlie Kirk was murdered in cold blood, and now we can say who, by Tyler Robinson.
He's the
A relatively,
suspect, or can apparently confess to it in yeah at this time.
yeah, the man in custody is Tyler Robinson, a relatively nondescript 22-year-old. And it's important to say that for several reasons here. And this will get somewhat heavy for a second. But here's why we need to say that. And then we need to talk about levels of cultural culpability, because that is a real thing. But this young guy, from what we know, I should use the alleged words, right? The alleged language, but
Mm.
from what we know, killed him from a rooftop, sniper style. So then we also have statements like the radical left is responsible for this murder. The inflamed rhetoric of our day can be blamed for this murder. And these are understandable statements, but I think dehumanization is a consistent danger here. As I was discussing some of this with my dad, Stuart McAllister, this was the word that he brought in, and it was a word that was missing from my own vocabulary. As I was thinking about these things. Dehumanization is something that is a very real temptation in a case like this from all perspectives. So on the one hand, Charlie Kirk, I thought it was important to say, yes, he's a son, he's a brother, he's a husband, a dad, and I should have also added he's a person made in the image of God. It's important to say all of that because for many people, he's also just a figure. You know, most of us didn't know Charlie Kirk.
Oh yeah.
And Charlie Kirk, or any kind of major celebrity or persona or figure, or especially a politician or somebody associated with politics, what often happens is they become effectively, for most people in their lives, a symbol or an ambassador of a certain movement. This is just inevitable. It's going to happen. You know, the president is a representative of a nation. A king was a representative of a nation. But let's not forget that the king, you know, Richard III was still a man. President Trump is still a human being. Charlie Kirk is a human being, but so is this young man who allegedly gunned him down. He is also a person. Now, for many people, he's going to be a representative. If you are heartbroken over what happened, and if you were a big fan of Charlie Kirk, the temptation will be to see this young man as a representative of all that is wrong with America right now. A picture of the growing nihilism and lawlessness and just the chaos of our nation. And while there may be some element, there may be some grains of truth in that. I want to kick it over to Nathan here because he really needs to give some input on this one. Let's not lose sight of the fact that we're still talking about a person who was a free acting moral agent who pulled that trigger. So in the end, he was an influenceable person. We all are. But a movement didn't necessarily pull that trigger. The movement didn't pull that trigger. Rhetoric didn't pull that trigger. A very specific human being pulled that trigger. I think we need to not lose sight of the humanity of anybody involved here.
So there's a dual dignity that you want to grant here and recognize the reason that shooting somebody is wrong is because you're dehumanizing them. You're not valuing the fact that they're made in the image of God. And so, and what you're challenging us to here, Cameron, I think, is that in our response to it, we don't end up doing the exact same thing of dehumanizing somebody. That being said, a 22-year-old in Utah doesn't come up with the idea that Charlie Kirk was a fascist all by himself. So
100%. Yeah.
there's a complex sense here in um anytime there's a tragedy, the first impulse is to figure out why. What was the motivation? Because it's like having a story that we don't have all the details to, and it drives us nuts until we can piece it together. And the temptation here is to reach for the solution that is the closest one, or the one that fits the story as we've already defined it in our minds before we even know all the details. And there's a very complex way of thinking of what it means to be human, which we are individuals and we do make choices, but also the content that we consume, the things that are fed to us, our friends, our digital friends, all are deeply transformative parts of who we are. The countries that we live in, the languages that we speak, the words that we use transform the way that our minds work. Um, and so it there isn't an easy um do you know what I'm saying here? Like, so what you said is
Yes.
true, but the rest of it is true too, and they're not mutually exclusive. It's the
Yes.
complexity of Tolstoy does this in War and Peace when he asks why did Napoleon invade Russia, and it's almost a 1,200 page book trying to sort that out. But the point that he's making is he said, why does an apple fall off of a tree? Is it because of a lack of moisture and the stem withered? Is it because of wind? Is it because of gravity? Is it because there's a little boy underneath it praying for it to fall? Is it because of and what he's trying to do with that book is to show the crazy complex causation behind anything that happens in the world and to say you live in this milieu and there are lots of things happening that lead up to this moment and there's so many little details that there's a sense in which an individual does make a choice, something like this, and then there's a sense in which maybe particular political voices and influences influence them, and there's a sense in which they are part of a culture that we all live in that we have to wrestle with and grapple with at the same time. And so that is a question. Again, I don't think we're going to solve this for people, but just my challenge here is recognize the complexity of this, call out evil for what it is, but understand how the roots and tentacles of evil are complexly interwoven into so many levels of what it means to be a human today that you know deep down in your heart that simple answers aren't true. And so there's something to grieve there and lament and to wrestle with. And it just and evil we Cameron and I, when we use the word evil, we're using that comprehensively, like a very deep and broad vision of that. Um, and not using it in a narrow sense that we're just defining somebody or some movement or some idea over there as evil. So that it's a big ball of wax, but make sure you're chewing on all of it.
I wonder whether one way of thinking about this, Nathan, might be helped along by people in the Middle Ages. And what I mean specifically is something, a habit of mind that we would today chalk up to superstition. But in the Middle Ages, it was just assumed, I use the word influenceable, not a very pretty word, but it was assumed that human beings were open to all kinds of influences, some of them heavenly and divine and angelic, some of them evil and and malevolent. And I think of think of a if you want to picture it, think about a wind chime and the music that the wind chime makes, or an aeolian harp, any kind of instrument that's played by the winds. Well, that's a bit of a picture of us as human beings. The reason we need to hear that, and the reason we need the wisdom of the Middle Ages, is because we default to a highly individualistic assumption where we just think of ourselves as these kind of atomistic or monadic units where, no, we are free acting agents and we do what we want, and we make our decisions and we act in freedom. This is one of the reasons why when something like this happens, we respond so strongly, but also why some people are saying, yeah, the left is to blame. So here's where the truth in statements like that can come in. Whenever you say, a movement is to blame for something. If you remember back, Nathan, and I hope I'm making sense here, but let me connect that up with, remember when the Columbine massacre took place? That was a major event for the nation. I remember it so vividly because I had just moved to the United States when that happened, and it was just a major, major, horrifying event. But I remember, do you remember, Nathan? There was a lot of, I mean, this, you would have been quite young, but maybe later on, you remember when the things like this happened. There was a lot of interest in what these two young men were listening to, and what they were
Mm.
watching, and what they were taking in. And so some of the musicians at the time came under heavy, heavy scrutiny, and all of that. And then or the video games they were playing came under heavy scrutiny. A lot of times the musicians tended to make some pretty aggressive music, and the video games were reliably quite violent, and the movies also quite violent and morbid. And so that got a lot of attention. And then that leads to sometimes these annoying debates about, hey, well, were these artists, in part responsible for this? And but really, what's being discussed is human beings are influenced and influenceable. So if you're putting into your head a steady diet of, it does, I mean, music, podcasts, it's steady dialogue of thought, and this is your kind of catechism. This is your kind of the liturgy for your day. It is playing a formative element. I mean, if you consume nothing but depressing music for a month, it will guaranteedly have an effect on your mood. If you consume a certain if you just expose yourself to if you just doom scroll every morning, first thing you wake up, and every night, first thing before you drift off into sleep, it will have a measurable effect upon you, on your moods, your anxiety levels, all of that. Now, does that absolve you of all moral responsibility in your mood swings when when you yell at somebody or when you're impatient? No. But is it a factor in your behavior? Well, first of all, let's back up. Do you exercise some authority on what gets airtime in your head?
Well, I would
You
certainly
do,
hope
actually,
so.
a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would hope so. So, responsibility is still present, but responsibility is also shared in the sense that we inhabit a fallen world where there is a lot of noise pollution, and a lot of it is very, very poisonous. We're gonna come back to the noise pollution piece because
Yeah. Okay.
it's
So
highly, highly important here. But yeah, let me pause.
let me push this in a different direct in a it's that same thing but further. And so this is being referred to as a political assassination, and it certainly is. I mean, it's difficult to see how it's anything other than that at this point. That being said, it the reason that it feels different, I think, to some people is that, well, let's go into from this direction. Charlie Kirk himself, I think people have said that you can see a arc in the type of thing that he was speaking about shift. So in his early and younger advocacy, it was very much free speech, gun rights, legal immigration, constitution, um, basic conservative American historical principles.
Cut
Um,
cut funding to universities slash D
yeah,
DEI.
yeah. And as Ross Douthat at the New York Times would put it, he wasn't far right. He was representing like the majority American conservative perspective in a younger format. Um, but and I think in the last 6 months or so, people noticed that he himself has started speaking about America's problems in far more spiritual categories than just political. So he uh, obviously phenomenally influential in the political sphere, and that's true. But Charlie Kirk himself saw the limitations to what politics could do. I'm talking about formal voting type politics could do for the well-being and the foundational sense of what it means to be whole and well and to be a culture and a country. And you and have been on that, and I think it's just because we're you're like a decade older than Charlie. I was saying I think we all go through that phase of like, um, this is how the world gets changed. And then in the last couple years, there's been, I think, this separation between, okay, well, um, you know, there's Washington D.C. and what happens there, and there's the mainstream media and what happens there, and then there's the reality of the rest of the world and our felt experience and the way in which we engage with each other and one another. And it's that separating bifurcation out
Yeah.
of like the political system isn't really making phenomenal changes. The academic elite has lost touch with the reality. The mainstream media is all bought and paid for by somebody else. Um, that's the feel in America right now. And so I think, yes, it's political, but on the other hand, it's way more than that. And I think Charlie himself was speaking about it. Like there wasn't I'm guessing there isn't a gun law that Utah could have passed that would have changed this. Or there isn't like that's what unsettles us about these things is like the evil isn't easily caged. Humans can't create structures that contain evil because it's in the human heart. And this highlights that gap, I think, of saying, even for somebody who's like, "Hey, you know what? Ezra Klein, New York Times, says Charlie Kirk was doing politics the right way. He was going out
Yeah.
there." Somebody he disagreed with in the ideas, but he said he's doing it. He's going out there. He's talking to young people. He's boots on the ground. He's spending time. He's respectfully dialoguing with people he disagrees with. And at the end of the day, it's friendly. Um, and I think you had a huge groundswelling of people saying this is the right way to do it, and then he gets shot in the neck. And they're like, "Well, I guess the gloves are off because if you can't do this, then what are our options for actually communicating?"
Yeah, that distinction that you're making between, on the one hand, politics, legislation, the laws of the land, that's all immensely important. But what you're talking about is what James Davison Hunter and also Christian Smith, two Christian sociologists, what they call deep culture. And the word we would use as Christians is just they're talking about the human heart. And
Mhm.
certainly, Charlie Kirk was only 31 years old. So his political sensibilities, his moral sensibilities, his intellectual sensibilities were all in a state of development. Still, I mean,
Mhm.
he was learning as he went. He was an activist, so very much a man of action. But you're right, that tone was changing, and I would say what he was doing was he was making a shift. He wasn't not to walk away from his activism regarding laws and all of that. I think he remained very devoted to that and saw that as critical and important, but he recognized that those laws won't make much of a difference if a person's heart has been swayed in a different direction, and that
So this is why I think he was so popular though, Cameron, because he spoke to both audiences. There were plenty of older fans who liked Charlie Kirk because of his get out there, get the youth to vote in the way that I want them to kind of mentality.
yeah.
But his deep following was he had a lot of friends in the conservative space, but like young people really, really liked him. And I don't think
Yeah.
it wasn't because of his formal political connection. It's because he sympathized with them like, "Hey, I recognize it's difficult to buy a house right now. Hey, I recognize it's hard to have a stable relationship right now. Hey, I recognize it's difficult to pay off your student loans. Hey, maybe we should be rethinking some." So there was that kind of he was way more than a political
Responsive.
Yeah, he was way more than a political figure for most of the people who are grieving
Yeah.
his death, even though they didn't know him. They felt like he understood their difficulties, um, in a way that politicians usually don't. And he wasn't a politician,
No,
technically.
he wasn't, and he wasn't formally educated, right? I mean, he was very likable, he was very relatable, he was highly articulate. Not everybody can get up and most people can't get up and command an audience the way he did, but he was in many other ways very relatable, and he was persuasive.
Well, yeah,
He
I mean,
helped.
he was basically credited with Trump winning the election for turning out the young male vote.
Right. So he and, honestly, just I think you and I were talking behind the scenes a little bit. He puts me in mind. I mean, very different people in some ways, but he reminds me of our late friend Nabil Qureshi in some ways. Just very, very passionate, zealous, also a really big
Charismatic.
guy,
Yeah.
charismatic. Looks like he'd be really fun at parties, that kind of thing.
But, I mean, it could
And
also, like, really grill you, but afterward, like, be totally chill and think it was a
slap
great
you on the back,
conversation. Yeah,
say,
and
"Let's go get the wings." Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there's kinda that thing going on.
But another item of note here that's really important. We live in a time where millions have succumbed to political idolatry. Now, this is nothing new. Political idolatry is just part of the human experience. Again, you peer down the corridors of history, you just see it all over the place. But what's what's a little bit unique right now, and what makes this more volatile, is that politics has kind of, for many people, functionally become the last real source of meaning and even a kind of salvation. Salvation is perhaps too big of a word, but just in the sense that it's the last big answer. If we can,
It's a proxy war fought by deep culture.
yes.
We're using it as a proxy for the disagreement that we sense in the differentiation in the way in which we collectively envision what it means to be us as a
and
nation.
so the reason this is pertinent here and the reason this matters a lot is because politics and I'm drawing on the thought of this is not original to me at all. I'm drawing on the thought particularly of James Davison Hunter and his latest book, Democracy and Solidarity. But what politics has become in our day is increasingly a vicious game, and really just nothing more than a vicious power game. And it's because it's sort of seen, and it's a zero-sum game. And whoever holds the cards, whoever's in charge, that's not only the person who gets to make the laws, increasingly, that's the person who gets to tell us what's real for a lot of people. So
Yeah,
that's
but if you're willing to shoot people, that doesn't matter.
that's
That's
the
the
shooting being yeah, the shooting people is part of that game, though. And that's why it also explains why doesn't completely explain, but it offers some perspective on why you would have some reactions of people celebrating the murder of a human being who is a father to young children, who is a husband, and the dehumanizing regular posts of people laughing, celebrating, dancing on the grave of somebody who has just died. This is why it is appalling, but also in a in a in an atmosphere where politics has been elevated to that level, it makes horrendous sense as well.
okay. Hang on. Let me jump in here and try to. This might be a bit of a stretch, and so I want to tread carefully. But this is what's coming to mind as we're thinking about this. The vast majority of college students were not born when 9/11 happened. They didn't. They never saw the World Trade Center. They didn't understand what it meant, what had happened. They never saw that in live time. They didn't live through that time in our country. For many of them, this is a similar type moment because, okay, on 9/11, you had 2 airplanes fly into buildings and kill a bunch of people, and that's sad. Charlie Kirk is a human, he gets killed, that's sad. But was there a significance to the fact that it was the World Trade Center other than just a big, tall building? And I would say, yes, there's massive symbolic value to a terrorist attack on that building and what it stood for and connected to the world. And so the towers were symbolic of a system. So they were a building full of people, and they represented a whole lot more too. And so when you saw people dancing in other countries at the celebration of the 9/11 attack, it wasn't just that people got killed, it was that symbol was destroyed. And in the same kind of way, you see Charlie Kirk was a man and he got killed, but also he was a symbol for a whole way of
Yep.
thinking and a whole way of engaging culture. And somebody who didn't have the ability to respond to that just shot him. And that's, I mean, it works. It's a shortcut for sure. And so there's kind of a parallel in my mind here of the thing that happened and the badness of what it is, but then what it symbolizes is what has the continuation of the effect on all of the people around it who were. Uh, I didn't even know what the World Trade Center was. I was a freshman in high school when that happened. I didn't understand the significance of it at that moment, but boy, it sure changed
Mhm.
a lot of history on the other side of that. And I don't want to make this that kind of moment too big, but if you are particularly close to somebody who's on the younger conservative spectrum who's taking this pretty hard, think about not just what it is, but what also the loss of what this symbolizes, and that might help you empathize a bit more with the way they're responding to this.
And we are very symbolic creatures. We can't that's part of our mental furniture always. And that's just an inevitable feature of how we look at the world. But that said, your remarks there are also putting me in mind of something that Miroslav Volf said. He says, it's actually very easy to change the world. Walk into a museum and destroy a great work of art or go kill somebody. It's very, so it's another way of saying it's very easy to destroy. But if you do that, if you take somebody's life, especially if it's a person who has a lot of influence and power, you've changed the world for the worse, but you've changed the world. It's a reminder of how hard it is to do something constructive, to build. And I think that's a point that Charlie Kirk would have been very sympathetic to. It's one of that I would say that is one of the hallmarks of the spirit of conservatism is that it is building something is much harder than tearing something down and then preserving it and ensuring its stability. It's the responsible thing to do, the harder thing to do, but the right thing to do, and it requires real virtue. And I also wanted to say, Nathan, I think it's important to point out that a lot of the rhetoric that's being used in some progressive circles, not all, but and a lot of, I mean, is extreme and it is irresponsible. And it's being used in some of our major centers of influence. I'm thinking in particular of universities. A lot of people have pointed out, and the reason, so why are you picking on the left, Cameron? Well, right now, because first of all, there's a number of, it's pertinent to this particular event in murder right now. Also, let's just point out something that's very obvious. Our friend Jonathan Haidt, he's not really our friend, but we quote him a lot. So I think we get to be he's our token, we're his token friends. But he points out that there is ideological homogeneity in most of our elite and Ivy League institutes. I mean, almost no conservative voices there. And so he himself is, I think, more left of center. But he says this is bad because there is no real intellectual diversity right now. And that tends to lead to all sorts of bad results. It leads to all sorts of groupthink. But he's also pointed out and has tried to build institutions that counter this phenomenon that a lot of professors are being irresponsible and abusing their platforms to manipulate their students and to so in other words, I don't think, Nathan, I'd love to get you to weigh in on this as well. I don't think it's harmless or neutral or just an intellectual statement to describe somebody as fascist or fascist adjacent or to style them to use that kind of terminology and to routinely do so in print and in
Okay,
podcasts, in
let's go here.
broadcasts.
I've got some thoughts. This
Let's go
is
here.
th-
Yep.
this feels this seems like, oh man, without sounding callous, I it's I'm seriously questioning which categories matter here. And let me say this, and we hinted at this, but this is a byproduct of a two-tier politics forming. You look at, um, 60% of Americans read at below a 6th grade reading level. The vast majority of people are getting their news from TikTok. Um, the and we could go on and on with statistics of saying, w I don't know if any political party actually has control of what's happening under their umbrella. So, as far as we know, the shooter in this case wasn't registered with a particular political party. It's too neat to say. And so, yes, the Republican and Democratic senators can both lament this and call this out. But you know what? I bet this kid wasn't listening to a lot of senators' perspective. They weren't reading the New York. I would be shocked if this guy was reading the New Yorker, and that's where he picked up his
Right.
ideology. And you can have
Sure.
the everybody like decrying this and all in the upper echelons of elite institutions, which were the historical makers of culture. There's an accountability structure. MSNBC anchor says um, something inappropriate about this and gets fired. Do you know who doesn't get fired? Somebody who has 3 million followers on YouTube and just runs a private channel podcast thing. That is that's the atmosphere that is forming the way that we think about reality. Most people don't give a rip about what your local senator or representative is if they could even name them. And so this is where this whole thing gets weird to me of like, okay, you have these people apologizing for this and they are saying Mike Johnson can go out and say we need to tone down the rhetoric within Congress. And sure, that's true. But I think we're giving way too much weight to that system as far as the actual deep cultural influence that it has in our country. There's way more conversation happening on X
Mhm.
and alternative forms of media and podcasts and behind the scenes and around kitchen tables and in gas stations and in barber shops and um, the institutions that used to have. It's like, did you ever go on like one of those rides at a fair with a little kid in a car that had a steering wheel, but clearly the steering wheel wasn't connected to anything, and you're just pretending that you're steering while you're going down the track? There's a little bit of a vision of that happening right now, where I think you have some of these political institutions that are twisting the steering wheel back and forth, thinking that they're driving, but they're on a track of something else, and they really don't have as much control as they think they do over the deep cultural sense and the way people are doing these things. So I would be hesitant to say, "Hey, I can point to this professor who said this thing that led to Tyler's shooting in this way." I almost wonder if the conversation has shifted subterranean from our most public and respected forms of conversation. I don't know that for sure. It
No
just
doubt it
it
has.
it's it because what happened is you look at even the last election cycle, podcast outperformed the mainstream media in their influence on the election. And then I think people just stayed with their influencers and don't really care what CNN thinks and haven't cared for some time. And that's, basically a marketing platform. But the challenge is here, like, I think this requires a whole different framing of like, so if you want to do something about this, what do you do? Or where do you engage, or where is culture really being shaped? That stuff still matters. But on the other hand, the felt experience of, I could say for sure, anybody my age and younger, is that the steering wheel is connected someplace else now for where we go from here. And I see the role of the church having tremendous opportunity in this. Let me say that optimistically as a Christian in this, but it's getting harder and harder to make a cause and effect connection between what we've been told in the past is the reason for things and how we see things play out.
Yes,
I'm just
no
thinking
doubt
out loud
about
here.
it.
This is a bit of a rant, but it's still ping ponging around in my head. If I'm trying to like, if I'm honest about connecting dots, those lines aren't in the places historically that the dots have said to be connected.
No, the traditional gatekeepers of culture are no longer those gatekeepers, but there are still major trickle down effects. A lot of the very rhetoric that we're talking about, still, if you follow it, you're gonna you will follow a lot of it back to some obscure academic. I don't think that that's changed. I think what has changed though is that now people take it and run with it and are able to disseminate it and represent it however they want. Misrepresent it, twist it, warp it, shape it, do whatever they want with on their little channels. So you're right. I mean, the places where we get it's basically a consumer's world when it comes to where you want to get your vision of reality. But that also means, given what you've said, that also means that there is a new level of responsibility on just us as everyday people in how we speak and how we use our voice, in what we post and what we say on our podcast. Yes, I mean, so here you and I are with our, you know, small audience, but also, but we, people with an audience, we have this platform. We're using it right now. I think the onus is really on all of us to be responsible with our words and to not contribute to that atmosphere of rage and antagonism. That doesn't mean turning a blind eye to justice or anything like that. But let's go back to something that you said at the very beginning of the podcast, something that's very, very important that you and I have talked about, because Nathan and I, some of you who are new around here maybe don't know that Nathan and I both went through the collapse of a major ministry at the time, the biggest apologetics ministry in the world, and lived to tell the tale and remained friends throughout that experience. When that was happening, when we were in the eye of the storm, so to speak, Nathan had put down some really good thoughts. I wish I had done that. I don't have a record of anything of what, maybe it's good that I don't have a record of what I was thinking, but it's good that Nathan, we have a record of what Nathan was thinking. But one thing that he was talking about was how we process and with whom we process, what our community looks like. Is it a digital community? Is it online? Or are we doing so with actual people? I'll let him say more about that because he'll say it better than I do. But when we're processing something like the murder of Charlie Kirk, and if it's something that has deeply, deeply, deeply affected us, I mean, there's going to be an impulse for many of us. We're all expressive Americans, and we want to, we want to share what we think. There's going to be a pronounced temptation to just post it, to talk about it, I mean, and to kind of process online rather than talk face to face with people and do that. The encouragement would be when these kinds of things happen, not necessarily to never post or anything like that, but to prioritize, I will say this, prioritize face to face
Mhm.
interactions with, particularly probably with, let's try to, people of real stability and maturity, if you have access to them. I'm thinking of people who might be spiritual leaders in your life, mentor figures, people who you really respect. Work through things like that. The raw emotions need to come out, but they probably don't need to come out on Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, Blueski, wherever they're coming out. I'd love to hear you say a
Yeah.
little bit about
Well,
this, Nathan.
let's wrap it up on this, and I'm sure we'll pick up this topic because there's a whole lot more that we want to say, but we're kind of going on here for time. But I think the way that I wrote my original thought is that where you choose to process a crisis shows you where your community actually is. And for a lot of people, that is in a digital space. And so if you've been posting a lot about this online, just recognize it's in where you choose to talk about this shows you where your community is. The first conversations I had about this were with my brother, and we were yelling while we were doing it because we were stacking hay in a barn, and the chatter of the hay elevator was so loud. We were every time we got close. So it was after work. We're sweating. We have hay seeds and chaff stuck all over our bodies, and we're just talking as we're working, as we're sweating. There are pauses, there are breaks. We're mentioning it. We're walking past each other, and there was a rhythm to the work and pauses in the conversation and questions and thoughts and reflections in the top of a barn that nobody was putting on YouTube. And that was a healthy way to begin thinking through some of these things. And then Cameron and I spent a bunch of time talking um, about things that we won't put on the podcast either. But man, if you can find people in life that you just slowly work through and have the non-judgmental atmosphere and freedom to throw ideas out and bounce them along and no, that's not quite right. Or, oh, actually, that is a helpful way to think about this. Um, Crave that, yearn for that, long for that, pray for that. There have been times in my life where I've felt very spiritually lonely and prayed for spiritual friendship. And so I think let one of the byproducts of this be the healthy reminder that Cameron has brought us is that how you're and where you're processing this, you can use that for a little bit of a litmus test of who do I talk to in difficult times and where do I process? And is that healthy? Is that how I want things to be 5 years from now in my life? Which direction am I growing? Am I growing increasingly isolated? Am I growing increasingly digital? Or am I growing in community with people who I can actually discuss these things with? And so um, let's be challenged by all of that as we lean into that because that is where deep culture is formed and our deep character and personality is formed. And in doing so, we put ourselves in a posture of asking the Lord to put people in our lives who would help us process reality in the correct way, and that God, by his Spirit, would shape and grow in us Christ likeness. And that is the way in which we change the world without killing people. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud. It's a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope. Obviously, this is a dark topic, but there is hope on the other side of death for the Christian, and there's much more to say about this story, and we'll see where it goes from here. But thank you for your patience and for thinking along with us.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.